if we have a referendum, I would vote for the unification with Romania.
These words were spoken in mid-January by Maia Sandu, the president of the Republic of Moldova. Coming from the head of state and the de facto leader of the pro-Western camp that has governed the country since 2021, the statement caused widespread surprise and drew renewed international attention to this small nation situated between Romania and Ukraine. And for good reason. It is not often that the president of a fully sovereign state, a member of the United Nations, and a candidate for the European Union membership, publicly expresses support for its own dissolution. Yet Moldova is a special case. The country was, after all, part of Romania in the interwar period, and unionism, the political idea advocating unirea, or reunification with its western neighbor, is in fact older than Moldova's independence itself. For years, not only individual politicians, but entire political parties, often represented in parliament, have openly embraced unionist rhetoric. It is enough to recall that the idea of a common state was supported by some activists and supporters of the Moldovan Popular Front, the movement that in the late 1980s launched the process of de-Russification and democratization in the Soviet Republic and ultimately led to Moldova's independence from the USSR in 1991. For some of the architects of Moldovan statehood, independence was therefore not an end in itself, but a stage, a step on the path toward eventual reunification with Romania. Sandu's remarks in support of reunification echoed in the following days by Moldova's Prime Minister, the Speaker of Parliament, and several ministers, therefore provide an excellent opportunity to examine how realistic such a scenario actually is. What do political elites in Bucharest think about it? Does Romania have the financial and institutional capacity to carry out such a complex project? So how realistic is a Romanian-Moldovan union? Let's find out. Maia Sandu's words about unification with Romania aren't just a historical footnote. They point to a potential shift in the EU and NATO's eastern borders, and with that, a change in the balance of power, EU funding flows, capital movements, and the geopolitical risk across the region. Decisions like this don't stop at the map. They may impact currencies, the banking sector, energy markets, and infrastructure. That's why when I look at politics, I also look at the markets. For that, I use XTB, an investment platform that gives access to over 8,500 stocks and ETFs from around the world. I can analyze companies in Central and Eastern Europe, as well as the energy and infrastructure sectors, where geopolitics directly translates into numbers. And you can invest commission-free up to 100,000 euros in monthly turnover. Then 0.2% provision applies. XTB has also prepared a free 2026 Outlook report outlining what may unfold this year from both a geopolitical and financial perspective. The ebook is available via the link in the description. Remember though that every investment involves risk and should be approached responsibly. Before we turn to the present, we need to step back for a moment into the past, because it is there that we find the broader historical context, one that helps explain where the unionist movement actually comes from. To begin with, the land stretching between the Prut and the Dniester, today forming the territory of the Republic of Moldova and historically known as Bessarabia, were for centuries part of the Principality of Moldavia. This was not an independent state, but a vassal principality that had existed since the 14th century. It was first subordinated to Polish rulers, and later, roughly from the turn of the 15th and 16th centuries, to the Ottoman Empire. In 1812, following a Russo-Turkish war, the Russian Empire succeeded in detaching Bessarabia from the principality, a moment that would prove to be a turning point in the history of the entire region and its people. Only a few decades later, however, the Principality of Moldavia and the neighboring region of Wallachia to the south two lands inhabited by populations speaking the same language and sharing almost identical cultural traditions began building a common state and a unified national identity. These efforts culminated in 1881 with the creation of the independent Kingdom of Romania, whose core was formed precisely by these two principalities. But what was happening further east? The Moldavians of Bessarabia, who after 1812 found themselves outside the borders of the principality, not only remained excluded from the state and nation-building processes that accompanied the birth of a unified Romania, they were subject to systemic Russification. In 1826, the Tsarist authorities banned the use of Romanian, the native language of the local population, in local administration, church liturgy, and education. At the same time, a large-scale policy of colonization and urban development was launched across the territory that had once belonged to the Principality of Moldavia. Rapidly growing urban centers began attracting large numbers of Slavic, Jewish, German, and Armenian settlers. Over time, these communities came to dominate the intellectual, economic, and administrative life of the province. As a result, while Romanian-speaking Moldavians had constituted an overwhelmingly majority of the population at the beginning of the 19th century, the Russian Empire's 1897 census showed that only slightly more than half of the region's inhabitants still declared Romanian as their native language. Meanwhile, the newly established Romanian state never fully accepted the fact that a large portion of the territory historically tied to one of its founding principalities remained under Russian control. So when the Russian Empire collapsed amid the upheaval of the 1917 revolution, Bucharest moved quickly to take advantage of Moscow's weakness and reasserted control over Bessarabia. Within a year, the region was incorporated into the Kingdom of Romania, and Romanian authorities began the long and difficult process of fostering a Romanian national identity among the local population. These efforts were cut short by the outbreak of World War II and the Soviet annexation of Bessarabia in 1940. Although Romania, allied with Nazi Germany and participating in the joint invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941, briefly regained control of the province, it lost it again just 3 years later, when the region returned to Moscow's rule. On the territory that today forms independent Moldova, the communist authorities established the Moldavian Soviet Socialist Republic. Its population was then subjected to a systemic and often harsh campaign of what could be described as de-Romanization. The key ideological tool of this policy was the concept of Moldovanism. This doctrine, a product of Soviet social engineering, was designed as an alternative to Romanian identity. It claimed that the people living between the Prut and the Dniester were not part of the Romanian nation, but a separate community with nearly 5 centuries of its own history, the only true heirs of the medieval Principality of Moldavia. According to this narrative, unlike their compatriots west of the Prut, Moldovans had preserved their authentic traditions instead of abandoning them into favor of what Soviet ideologues portrayed as an artificial and short-lived Romanian identity. Promoters of this ideology argued that Moldovans spoke their own language, in reality a slightly more archaic form of Romanian enriched with Slavic loanwords and written in the Cyrillic script, and possessed distinct customs and cultural traditions supposedly closer to the Slavic world than to Romania. Yet despite nearly half a century of Sovietization and Moldovanization, Moscow never fully succeeded in erasing the population's cultural and linguistic ties to Romania. As a result, in the 1980s, the national revival movements mentioned earlier began to take shape. Among their central demands were the return to the Latin alphabet, the rehabilitation of the Romanian language, and the rejection of the Moldovanist doctrine. As public life gradually liberalized, unionist slogans also began to appear more openly, presenting reunification with Romania as the natural culmination of a broader process of decolonization and a break with the Soviet legacy. Ask the average Romanian about Moldova, And the answer usually comes without hesitation. The country is seen as a historical part of the Romanian homeland, and its people as Romanians who were Sovietized, a population that Moscow spent decades persuading they were a separate nation from their brothers across the Prut. This perception is reflected in public opinion. In a 2012 survey, nearly 85% of Romanians declared that Bessarabia was, in their view, Romanian land. For decades, this way of thinking translated into consistently high, and often very high, support for the idea of reunification. According to available polling, between 2012 and 2021, support for the creation of a common state ranged from 60 to as much as 85% of Romanian society. But the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine in February 2022 brought a sharp shift in public sentiment. In a survey conducted immediately after the invasion began, only 11% of Romanians supported the idea of immediate reunification with Moldova. 3 times as many, 33%, opposed it outright. The largest group, 42%, said that, quote, "this is not the right moment," while another 14% had no opinion. In practice, this showed that Romanian support for Unirea is not unconditional, and that society approaches the issue far more pragmatically than romantically. Russia's war against Ukraine raised a fundamental concern that incorporating Moldova could mean not only enormous financial and administrative costs, but also the risk of direct confrontation with Moscow. Especially since Russia still maintains a military presence on Moldovan territory, in the separatist region of Transnistria, where around 1,500 Russian troops remain stationed. Under these conditions, reunification began to look less like an act of historical justice and more like a potential source of instability, and a security risk for Romania itself. Today, roughly 1 in 2 Romanians supports the idea of a common state. That means backing for reunification has recovered significantly compared to the immediate aftermath of the 2022 invasion, but it remains well below pre-war levels. Why? Part of the answer is obvious. The war is still ongoing, and the scenario continues to look risky to many Romanians. But increasingly, another factor appears to matter just as much: Romania's own difficult economic situation, which is making the prospect of integration far less appealing than it once seemed. Over the 3 decades that followed the fall of communism, Romania achieved a remarkable development leap. Between 1990 and 2021, the nominal size of its economy expanded 7.5 times, while GDP per capita increased nearly 8-fold. The country was rapidly closing the gap with Europe's more advanced economies. At the time of its EU accession in 2007, Romania's GDP per capita, measured in purchasing power standards, stood at just 40% of the EU average. By 2021, it had risen to 74%. In recent years, however, the Romanian economy has begun to lose momentum. After the strong post-pandemic rebound in 2021, when GDP grew by around 5.7%, growth has steadily slowed. In 2022, it fell to roughly 4%, in 2023 to around 2%, and in 2024 and 2025, growth hovered near 1%, effectively amounting to economic stagnation. The slowdown has been accompanied by rising prices that are increasingly felt by households. Over the past 5 years, Romania's consumer basket, the set of essential goods used to measure inflation, has become roughly 50% more expensive. At the same time, since the pandemic, the country has been struggling with a persistently high budget deficit, which between 2022 and 2025 ranged from 6 to 9% of GDP annually. This has led to a sharp increase in public debt, from about 35% of GDP before the pandemic to roughly 55% in 2024. The situation has not gone unnoticed in Brussels. 5 years ago, Romania was placed under the excessive deficit procedure, which is triggered when a country's annual deficit exceeds 3% of GDP or public debt surpasses 60% of GDP. The procedure obligates governments to take rapid steps to stabilize public finances and allows the EU to suspend part of its funding if corrective measures are not implemented. As a result, in the second half of last year, the Romanian government was forced to begin a painful fiscal consolidation, raising taxes, cutting spending, and gradually slowing wage growth in the public sector. Among other measures, value-added tax and excise taxes were increased. For households, this means declining real purchasing power and growing economic uncertainty. According to available surveys, as many as 76% of Romanians are now dissatisfied with the country's situation and believe it is, quote, heading in the wrong direction. Under these conditions, the prospect of integrating one of Europe's poorest countries, and Moldova is exactly that, no longer looks like a historic mission. Instead, it increasingly appears as a potential additional burden on already strained public finances. Economic pragmatism is therefore increasingly balancing, and in some cases outweighing national sentiment. Romania's political mainstream approaches the question of reunification with its eastern neighbor with a certain ambivalence. On the one hand, virtually all major political parties, much like their voters, agree that the Republic of Moldova represents a historical part of the Romanian state. The country is often described simply as a, quote, second Romanian state, inhabited in nearly 80% by ethnic Romanians. Bucharest does not recognize the existence of a distinct Moldovan nation, arguing, not without reason, that its supposed separateness is the result of the Soviet social engineering discussed before. For this reason, Romanian politicians addressing the population across the border rarely refer to them as Moldovans. Instead, they speak of, quote, brothers across the Prut, Bessarabians, or at most, citizens of the Republic of Moldova. Reunification would increase Romania's territory by about 14% to roughly 272,000 square kilometers, for comparison, around 87% of Poland's area. Its population, currently about 19 million, would grow by another 2.5 million, bringing the total close to 21.5 million. A larger territory and population would naturally mean greater geopolitical weight, potentially strengthening Bucharest's position within both the European Union and NATO. For that reason, there is hardly a significant political figure in Romania who, when asked about Unirea, would openly oppose it. A recent example comes from the Prime Minister, Ilie Bolojan, who stated at the end of January that if a reunification referendum were held, he would vote without hesitation to incorporate Moldova into Romania. Within the Romanian establishment, a mantra has taken hold. Bucharest is ready to begin a reunification process, or at least discussions, the moment the people of Moldova express a clear desire for it. And yet, despite these declarations, Romanian authorities have never taken any active steps toward actual reunification. One notable exception is Bucharest's long-standing policy of granting Romanian citizenship to Moldovan residents. As ethnic Romanians, they can obtain Romanian passports relatively easily. Today, it is estimated that around 1 million Moldovans hold Romanian citizenship. Beyond that, however, there is no official roadmap and no concrete scenario outlining how reunification would actually be carried out. This raises an important question. Perhaps the political mainstream does not truly see reunification as a goal to be actively pursued, but avoids distancing itself from the idea out of concern for public opinion. Because while Romanian society may be reluctant to bear the potential costs, financial, administrative, and security-related, many still view reunification as an act of historical justice and a step that would strengthen Romania's international standing. After all, very few countries can claim that another state openly aspires to become part of them. In reality, the situation is more complicated. Romania's political elites are well aware that any reunification process would be extremely difficult and costly. Even cautious estimates put the price tag at around 60 to 80 billion euros over the first 15 years after the process begins. That would amount to roughly even 3.5% of Romania's annual public spending, or a little over 1% of GDP. A separate and even more complex challenge is Transnistria, a Russian-controlled separatist region on Moldova's eastern flank. If somehow Russian troops were removed from the area, something that is difficult to imagine under current conditions, and the breakaway republic were incorporated into Romania together with the rest of Moldova, Bucharest would face the daunting task of integrating and de-Russifying the region. Transnistria differs sharply from the rest of Moldova, not only in economic and administrative terms. Its so-called state structures are deeply infiltrated by individuals linked to or directly controlled by Moscow. Moreover, the overwhelming majority of its population does not speak Romanian. Faced with these risks and costs, or rather seeking to minimize them, Bucharest has adopted a different strategy. For years, Romania has consistently supported Moldova's European integration, acting as Chișinău's main advocate within the European Union and on the broader international stage. This policy serves, above all, to limit Russian influence in Moldova, a goal that clearly aligns with Romania's own security interests. The more deeply Moldova is anchored in Western institutions, and more closely its economy is tied to Western markets, the harder it becomes for Moscow to exert political and economic pressure. But European integration appears to serve another purpose as well. From Bucharest's perspective, Moldova's path toward the EU is also a mechanism that gradually brings the two countries closer to potential reunification. Since receiving official candidate status in 2022, Moldova has been required to align its legislation with EU law, and by extension, with Romania's legal framework. The accession process also involves building institutions compatible with European standards, reforming the judiciary, and implementing wide-ranging economic reforms. All of this is supported by European funding and technical assistance. The European Union, along with Western partners such as the United States, is also financing key infrastructure projects, including roads and energy systems designed to strengthen Moldova's energy security. Brussels is likewise engaged in efforts to keep resolve to Transnistria issue. In practice, the accession process is bringing Moldova structurally closer to Romania, while allowing Bucharest to avoid the direct costs of integration. A future reunification with a modernized Moldova already inside the EU, or at least on the threshold of membership, would simply be far less expensive. From a strategic standpoint, this logic is hard to dispute. Though, ultimately, everything will depend on one crucial factor: what the Moldovan people themselves decide. In the end, the attitudes of Moldova's own citizens may prove to be the biggest obstacle to reunification. At first glance, support for Unirea appears to have grown steadily. While only 10 to 15% of Moldovans backed the idea in 2010, the figure rose to around 25% by 2017, and during the pandemic it briefly exceeded 40%. But this trend requires careful interpretation. The increase was driven not primarily by rising pro-Romanian sentiment, but by growing frustration with the country's domestic situation, and a broader sense of disappointment with the political project that is the Republic of Moldova itself. As a result, a growing share of voters who had previously been neutral toward reunification, mainly pro-European citizens, or at least those not opposed to cooperation with the West, began to view union as a potential solution to economic stagnation, corruption, and a shortcut to rapid EU integration. However, when the Party of Action and Solidarity, aligned with President Maia Sandu, came to power in 2021, promising reform and real progress toward Europe, support for reunification began to decline again. Today it stands at around 33%. For now, there is no sign of majority backing for the unionist idea. This raises a natural question. If support for reunification remains limited, why would the president publicly endorse a scenario that has little chance of being realized in the near future. In fact, Maia Sandu's statement was neither accidental nor careless. Her personal views on the issue have long been well known. Even as an opposition leader, she openly declared that she would vote for reunification in a hypothetical referendum. For years, however, she avoided the topic for political reasons. The pro-European electorate that sustains her party includes both union supporters and voters firmly attached to Moldova's independence. Only now, during her second and final term, at a time when some union-leaning voters have begun drifting toward more radical political forces, has it become politically safer for her to restate her position and help prevent further erosion of that segment of support. But there was also an important external dimension. By publicly expressing support for reunification, fully aware that her words would resonate internationally, Sandu drew attention to Moldova's fragile geopolitical position and the continuing Russian threat. In the context of the war in Ukraine, Chisinau is seeking to maintain sustained Western attention to its security challenges and to accelerate its path toward European integration. The suggestion of reunification as a potential alternative therefore serves as a subtle form of pressure on European partners. If the accession process drags on, Moldova may eventually be forced to consider other ways of securing its long-term place in the West. At the same time, the message was directed at Moscow. It was a reminder that any attempt to pull Moldova back into Russia's sphere of influence could produce the opposite outcome. Whether reunification will ever actually happen remains an open question. For now, there is neither a social majority in Moldova nor the political readiness in Romania to embark on such a costly and risky process. And yet, the two countries are moving closer to each other faster than at any point in recent history, through growing infrastructure links, economic integration, and above all, their shared European trajectory. The paradox is this: Unirea may never be formally declared, and yet the border on the Prut could gradually lose its real significance. That, in fact, appears to be the most likely scenario today. Not a single historic decision, but a slow process of convergence. Not a political event, but a structural transformation.